Ross. I'm chairing this meeting. We have a fantastic evening in front of us, and this our speaker is Bal, and he's a leading auditor, both for security and also for the quality side. And he'll give you a lot more information about this, but I think you're going to find this particularly interesting. Please put all of your questions in the chat, and they'll be dealt with at the end. Because we're recording it, we don't want to take any questions en route. So if you can put your questions in the chat, and Val will deal with it at the end. So at that stage, I'd like to pass across to Val and say thank you very much for this presentation.
So, hi everyone. My name is Bal Matu. I'll introduce myself a little bit more on the next slide. Thanks everyone for taking the time out to come and listen to the webinar, which is going to be on cybersecurity and the importance of your security posture. So a little bit about myself to start with. I got my industrial experience in mainly the defence industry. I did a couple of years as a quality manager. I've worked for an accredited certification body. I spent the last 30 years or so being an auditor, consultant and a trainer. And I've been doing auditing on a contract basis for accredited certification bodies throughout those 30 years. I'm an OCA registered lead auditor for quite a few standards, which is the regular IT standards 20,000, 27,000, 22301. There's a scheme called Tiki Plus. We'll talk a little bit about it later. It actually brings together a lot of these standards into one scheme. I also do audits for the World Lottery Association, and I'm a Cyber Essentials certification auditor. I'm a certified ethical hacker and a CREST registered penetration tester. I have my own business that actually does has Cyber Essentials certifications, and I've got the link there to the website if anybody's interested in following through on that. What I've done with today's webinar is I've put it into four parts. The first part, I'm just going to introduce a little bit about why you should sort of try and build a good security posture for a business, and a little bit about what I think a good security posture is. Then we're going to talk about some security frameworks. I've picked 4 frameworks that I've worked with, and I'm going to use those as examples. And then in part 3, I'm going to sort of introduce a little scenario where we use bits of each of those frameworks and what's common about those frameworks to then show how we can create that good security posture that we're trying to achieve. And then finally, in part 4, which is all summarized in just one summary slide, I'll recap on what I think the key ingredients are that are actually, when we're implementing in that scenario-based situation, what are the key ingredients that would promote that posture that creates that security culture and behavior that we want to sort of see in every organization. So I'll start off with the first part, which is just introducing that term security posture and what I mean by it. So what are we actually striving for? What if we do get that security posture, it'll not only address technical aspects of information security, it'll also address what we need to do from a physical security perspective, the cultural and the behavioural aspects. But what it does more than anything, when you've got that good posture, it actually demonstrates effective leadership and governance. So they're all like parts of many, many security frameworks. But what we'll see from this presentation or this webinar is that you can put in security controls into most organizations quite easily. The IT department or the security manager can go away into a corner and they can create controls that meet the requirements of a standard or a framework. But what makes the big difference is the way that those controls address the business critical information risks and how the risk owners are identified, how the asset owners are involved in that process, how it's all brought together and promoted. And that's what we'll talk about in this webinar, how to do that in a way that promotes that security posture. Now, just to set the scene a little, there's an organisation known as the World Economic Forum, and every year they produce a risk report. And the Global Risk Report for 2022, and it's freely downloadable. Any sort of Google search will help you find it. And what I wanted to point out was that cybersecurity failure is identified as one of the top short-term global risks. There's another organisation known as the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. In short, it's known as, with the terms ENISA. So they also produce a report every year. And if you look at the threat landscape that they identified for 2021, they identified, it's a very good report, and you can download it from this website here. Easy to find any Google search. But what they point out is that there are new forms of risks coming along all the while, and it's changing. So they're always the same sort of risks, and they talk about all of the different types. But the good thing about it is it identifies what the changing landscape is. And as you can sort of see from just a few that I've picked out, that this phishing email risk is growing. So although we've trained all our users to not click on links in suspicious emails, they're still not aware that they can also be phished via text messages and phone calls. And they talk about new trends, phishing as a service, where the bad actors can now actually almost order from a catalogue a phishing campaign as a service. So it's getting easier for them to sort of almost buy it as a commodity and push it out. It sets the scene a little for what is a security posture then. We've got to be prepared for those cyber risks that are talked about in the by the World Economic Forum and the ENISA threat landscape. And the way we can do that is we need to have that posture, and we can tell if we've got a good posture, because if we have, we'll be able to predict, prevent, and respond to those sort of threats. So it's our confidence in our ability to be able to not only say we've got an information security management system, or we've got cybersecurity certification. It's about how agile we are in terms of how we will detect something new appearing on our doorstep, trying to get our information, trying to harm our business, and how we can react to it. And that's going to be how well we've established the understanding of our information security assets, our business critical assets. How well do we understand what they are? How effectively we've managed to do our risk assessment and identify the controls. But not only identify the controls, but to give those controls an owner, to have asset owners, to have risk owners within the business. And very often those asset owners and risk owners should be senior managers and sometimes board members. Once we've done that, we've also then got to train all our staff. And we'll talk a little bit about the resources that are available to be able to do that. So moving on to part 2. So we understand what we're going to try and do with in terms of a security posture, which is more like the things that keep the information security controls real and effective. That's what we're talking about in terms of the posture. So let's just talk about the frameworks first that help us identify the controls that we should have in place. And I'm going to talk about 4 frameworks just briefly, just to set the scene a little bit in terms of where do these controls come from and what is the variety of controls out there. And then we'll cut to the chase and pick out some key ones that help us create that posture that we want. There's a Cyber Essentials scheme, which is made up of 2 parts, Cyber Essentials Certification Self-Assessment and Cyber Essentials Plus, which is more of a tested assessment. Now, the focus on that scheme is on risks that are from the internet. And the controls in that scheme are mandated. And then you've got ISO 27001, which is broader. It includes internet risks, so it goes beyond what the Cyber Essentials scheme requires. But the difference is that the organization does its own risk assessment and it sets its own thresholds of what is an acceptable level of risk. Whereas the Cyber Essentials, that risk assessment is done by the scheme owners, who are the National Cybersecurity Centre. So the risk assessment has already been done and the controls are mandated. So the key difference there. And then you've got the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I'll talk about in more detail in a bit. But that's, again, is a risk-based framework. It's based on a catalogue of controls, and they break down, and then it eventually links these recommended controls to information sources, such as ISO 27000. And then we've got a scheme known as Tiki Plus, which I've been involved in for many years, which is bringing together a lot of the standards that IT organisations have to sort of meet and putting them into one framework. And again, we'll take a very quick look at that. So the Cyber Essentials scheme, it is focused on internet-borne risks, yeah, and the controls are mandated. That you know, you don't pick and choose the level of control that you want. It's the level of control is given to you, and there are 5 areas of controls that are specified. There's requirements about the firewall setup, the secure configuration of devices, user access control, malware protection, and patching and updating of software applications. If we look at ISO 27001, there's a a structure to the standard, and it's based on a plan, do, check, act sort of cycle. And I just want to point out that it's based on risks. So there's a section in here in the planning section that says you identify your risks and have a risk treatment plan. And then when you're in the doing part of delivering whatever service you're delivering, then you also need to do ongoing risk assessments and updating risk treatment plans. And then in addition to the management system, which is this plan, do, check, act, there's an annex with a lot of technical controls that you have to sort of justify their use or their non-applicability. So if we compare Cyber Essentials and ISO 27000, what we find is that whereas Cyber Essentials scheme is much narrower in its scope, the risk assessment isn't down to the organisation to do. The risks have been identified. It's the controls that are mandated. And there's 5 areas of those controls. And there's 2 levels of certification. One is self-declared, but still reviewed and accepted by a certification body assessor, a trained and competent registered assessor. And then there's another level, which is called Cyber Essentials Plus, which is independently tested using test tools and vulnerability scans and the like. If you compare that to 27001, the risk assessment is done by the organisation. So if the organisation doesn't identify a risk, say for instance, a risk of phishing, or they fail to do a risk on the way the secure configuration of maybe laptops or the applications that are in use, then it might go missed, as it were. And the level of risk that's acceptable, again, is determined by the organisation. But there are 114 controls divided into 14 categories in this standard. And it's based on a management system which should be continually improving, as I showed you in that previous diagram, based on plan, do, check, act. Certifications are performed by accredited certification bodies, and they do these audits based on effectiveness checks by looking at records of the management system in use. There's no actual technical testing as part of these certifications. Whereas the Cyber Essentials scheme doesn't focus too much on processes, it more cuts to the chase and does the tests to check how well the malware applications are working and how well the browsers are configured in terms of security configuration and the use of two-factor authentication by admin accounts, things like that. So this cuts to the chase and just does a test, but it's much narrower scope. So if we compare these two schemes, this is very technical, as you can see from the sort of things that get tested and checked. And it's very much focused on vulnerabilities through the internet. 27001 is more generic. It's across all industry sectors, and it's not only internet risks. But it's up to the organisation to identify the risks and threats and justify any of these controls that it feels that are not applicable. And then the certification body would check that those controls are really not applicable, and whether, if they are applicable, the stated controls have been implemented effectively. Now, the NIST cybersecurity framework takes a slightly different stance, and what it does is it tries to start by talking in a business language before it gets into the technical language. So what it does is it helps the business users to be able to communicate to the operations users of the management system. So the good thing about it is that it's easier for business owners, business directors who aren't not necessarily familiar with the technicalities of security controls to understand a little bit about which controls are important in their business context. The way it does that is that it requires you to work out how you're going to improve your security posture by identifying your current profile, which is where you are now, your as-is state, and for you to identify a target profile, but you determine your own target profile. And the idea is that there are 5 of these focus areas and 5 functions, 23 of these categories, and there are 108 subcategories. And then these subcategories link to the guidance, such as 27001 there. And you got COBIT, which is the ISACA framework, and NIST guidelines as well. So there's a structure there, but where it starts off here on the left, that's business speak. And when it goes all the way across to these subcategories, it's now speaking technical speak. So it's good at making that translation and helping everyone in the business understand where you are, particularly if you go use this technique, which is what they promote, where you have your current profile and your target profile, which is a bit like identifying the gaps of where you are and where you want to be. And you do that for each of these in terms of, do you want it to be high, medium, low? You know, how far do you want to go with this control? And that decision would be based on how does that fit in with the type of business you are, and how do these subcategories affect your overall business goals and what your customer expectations are. So you make the choices, and then it's basically self managed as a way of improving your security posture. And then the full scheme, just a couple of slides on this now, is the Tiki Plus scheme, which is based on 2 standards, 40 processes, and these processes are mainly from 2 standards. One is on software lifecycle processes, and the other one is on systems lifecycle processes. And so really, Tiki Plus is pitched at mainly IT companies, and it helps you develop these processes in a way that you only do the ones that are necessary for your scope of business. And there are these scope profiles that you could go for. So if you're just a security management consultancy, you might go for this profile. If you're a service desk, you would go for this. If you're a development company, you would go for this one. And of course, you could mix them up if you did more than one of these scope profiles. It identifies some processes that are mandatory, which are typically the management controls required by all of the ISO standards. And then you've got the technical processes, which, if they have a tick in the box, they are required if that's what you're into. So if you took an IT service management company, these are the processes that they would be required to implement, and they're generally the processes that would be required by ISO 20000. And if it was security, then it would be these: configuration management, information management, problem management. Now I've highlighted problem management because I'm going to use that on the next slide as an example of what the guidance you get from this scheme looks like. Every process has some outcomes, and every process of those 40 processes that I've showed you earlier, they all have a process purpose. And the idea is that you implement these base practices, but with a view to changing these input work products into output work products. And the idea then is they're mapped to the various ISO standards. So there's your 27,000 column. So if I take one of these base practices that we can relate to, so the we should be learning from incidents. So we should be creating improvement. So take, for example, a security incident. We should be improving, and we should be analysing the trends, monitoring performance, and trying to identify areas for improvement. And if we're getting repeated types of security incidents, then we should be identifying what the problem is that really needs to be addressed, to identify the underlying cause. And then what we should be doing is identifying the stakeholders to be informed of the status of those problems, try and bring about an overall improvement. But that should be done in a way that meets the requirements of ISO 27000 clause 10, which is about improvement, and clause 8.16, or the control 8.16, which is about security incident management. But the way we should do that is we should be doing that base practice with a view to bringing about that improvement, identifying those root causes and trends, with a view to achieving this outcome, which is making sure that they're not recurring, with a view to achieving the purpose, which is to make sure that we identify root causes to prevent recurrence of those issues. And the idea is that this should help us get better and better. So there are 40 of these, and it's basically doesn't detract from the requirements of 27,000 because you still have to do it all and it's mapped. But this is more business speak based on those two IT standards, which is software lifecycle, which is ISO 12207, and systems engineering lifecycle, which is 15288. So we just had a very quick look at 4 framework schemes, standards, and what's common. Well, when you read between the lines, and if you implement them effectively, they will all promote good security posture. Because what they all do is they all require you to identify your business critical assets and their owners. They all expect a risk assessment, or they're based on a risk assessment and gap assessment having been performed. They all require you to implement controls and to treat the gaps that you identify. They all talk about leadership responsibilities and accountability. They all want some sort of monitoring and tracking. They all want you to learn from incidents. And they all expect a level of training for all levels within the organisation. The difference is that you can do all that, but still not get a good security posture. So what I'm going to do in this next section, which is really the core of the structure of this presentation, I'm going to use this scenario to go through those steps typically and point out the bits that if they don't get done in a particular way or without certain considerations, how that could lead to a bad security posture, or you miss the opportunity to promote the good security posture. So let's consider the scenario of a typical software development company. It's using some cloud tools, for example, like Jira, GitLab. It's developing software products. They've got staff working at more than one site, and they outsource some of their activities. Typical. I think most software companies will find themselves in that sort of scenario. So as I mentioned earlier, all of these schemes require you to first of all identify your business critical information assets. And what you should also do is, for each of those business critical information assets, nominate an owner. So let's take Jira as the example. The best owner there would be the higher we can get in the organization. So let's say the development director, it could be the development team manager, it could be the development team leader. But the higher up you can assign that ownership, the better it will be for the posture of the business, the security posture. The same for the developers' laptops that are going to be used for accessing the cloud and for accessing the source code. Now, once we know who the owner is, it's the owner then that should identify the business criticality. Is it high, medium, or low? In that, what would be the impact on the business if that data got corrupted and couldn't be restored? So we shouldn't just sort of like assume as an IT department, say, that, oh, it's very high and we don't need to go and ask the owner. Because then what happens is that we've missed the opportunity for that business owner or asset owner to understand what we're trying to do by implementing the controls. Because those controls have got to be implemented in a way that they're protecting that owner, they're protecting his assets. So he's the accountable person within the business. And he's the one that would be held accountable if that data were to get infected with ransomware or become corrupted through some misuse or hardware failure and the backups weren't available or they hadn't been taken. So we must involve them, although it's very easy to make assumptions and not involve them. Equally, it's the same owner that should authorize who has access to the users, who has access to the data. So they should be they should authorize and review on a regular basis who does have access. And it should be the same owner that agrees with the IT what the frequency of the backup should be. Now, so sometimes it goes wrong at this stage because the security manager or the IT or the information security consultant who's implementing the information security system knows the value of the data. They think they know who should have access to it, and they think they make an informed judgment on what the backup frequency should be. The difficulty with that approach is, yes, it gets the process written. Yes, it gets the access provided to the right people. Yes, it gives the the asset the right value. The difficulty is when we're short of the funding to get the backups to run at the right frequency, or the resources to change the access levels or review the access levels. The owner, who's the person who usually has the budget to provide the resources to do those activities, doesn't understand why you need those resources, because they haven't been bought in, they haven't understood the purpose of it. So if we went on and did a risk assessment, just a very crude risk assessment of our scenario, we'd identify 6 obvious risks. And those 6 risks, we can pick controls from any of those frameworks, and these would be those controls. So I won't just bore you by reading them out, but let's pick a few out. So if we took the hardware corruption failure, if we've got good backups, the data could get corrupted and we could restore, so we're safe. One of the difficulties is if the backups are only done once a week, there's a chance that we're going to lose a week's worth of work. How expensive is that? And at particular points of a development project, a week's development could be a lot to lose. It's the business owner, the asset owner, that should be deciding the frequency of the backups, not IT. So if we took each of these control requirements that we've identified in our risk assessment, what we should be doing is saying who's accountable, who's responsible, and if it comes into the decisions for implementing the controls, who should be consulted, and then once we've got the control in place, who should be informed. So a simple RACI matrix can help, and this is a simplified version just to show you how it would work. So for instance, taking that backups example again, the board would be accountable, IT would be responsible for doing them, but the asset owner should be consulted. So if it doesn't happen, if the backups don't exist, the business will probably fail, and it's the board that would be accountable. So once the board have decided, yes, we want to do the backups, we need to do them, they're a critical control we want implemented, they assign it to the IT department. The IT department would be responsible for doing it. So if it's not done, they would be held responsible. But they need to consult the asset owner to find out the criticality of the data, how frequent he wants it backed, how long he could go between backups. And that's typically how each of these controls should work. And the idea is, yes, it slows down implementation because a lot of the times the IT could make a good guess at it, an informed guess of what that should be. But by doing it in isolation, they miss out on the opportunity to promote good leadership and governance and ownership by those senior people in the business that have got the most to lose and have the biggest interest in making that security management work and mitigating the risks. And by helping them understand the risks and discussing the risks with them, just by going through that exercise of why we need to do the backups. Now, how critical is that data to the business, and how we should control who has access to it, How often should we review who has access to it? That exercise in itself is educating those business owners and asset owners and helping them lead by example and be involved in the implementation of those controls. If you know you're accountable for the backups, then you might want to know how well are the backups working, and you might be interested in the risk if the backups fail. And if you know the asset owner and you know that the IT are doing some backups of your data, it's your data, and they're doing it for you, then you might be interested in a governance report that tells you whether the backups are successful. So the good thing about that exercise of identifying the asset owners and the risk owners, the good exercise about that is then it helps you prioritize which of the risks to do first. It doesn't matter which of those frameworks you go, you'll end up with a lot of gaps, you'll end up with a lot of controls to implement. But how do you prioritize them? Well, the best way to prioritize them is by the business risk. And you'll need resources to implement those controls. Well, the people that own those resources are the asset owners and the risk owners. So unless they understand the risks and the business criticality of the assets, they're unlikely to provide the resources that are needed to put in the controls. So once we've prioritized these controls, then we need to track and monitor their progress, because everyone's got a day job. You know, their main job for most people within the business is not implementing security controls or improving security controls. It's not their main purpose for being there. So unless we set up some sort of dashboard or scorecard to track the progress of these controls in a prioritized way, and we get the buy-in from the people who control the resources that would help us do it, we're on a hiding to nothing. Once we've got all the controls in place, it doesn't stop there, because then we need to monitor the effectiveness of the controls and the way they're implemented. And by monitoring the effectiveness of the controls and the way they're implemented, that means that we keep that leadership support in place. And again, it will be done through some sort of dashboard scorecard. So just rattling through those risks very quickly. If we take risk number one, we want to implement complex passwords. The NCSC website talks about using 3 random words, and it's a good way of coming up with a complex password that is easily remembered. We need to have an acceptable use policy. The requirements in it need to be very clear and not confusing, so the structure of it is important. Whenever we use a cloud service, we should be using 2-factor access. And if you do download the WEF, that World Economic Forum report and the ENISA form that I talked about earlier, that will reinforce the need for doing that. We should only be providing access for the role that people have. You know, it should be a least privilege access. And people shouldn't be using administrator accounts for day-to-day work. So there should always be separate standard user accounts that people are using for doing their email and their web browsing. An administrator account should be very separate to that. But number 2, about the backups, the frequency needs to be agreed with the asset owner, and there needs to be regular testing as well. that the backups are effective. So in an ideal world, the data should exist in at least 3 places. In terms of business continuity plans, they should be based on a business impact assessment. Again, coming back to that idea of the business criticality of the assets. And we should be doing tests based on scenarios such as data loss, power outages, network outages, physical disruption. The theft loss risk is the easiest one for most people to understand, and it's it's basically stopping the bad guys from getting hold of the data, stealing it, and people having unauthorized access to the facility, the zones that we're in. And it should be closely linked with security incident process. The key thing about the security incident process is that ability to learn from incidents. And people should be encouraged to log incidents. There should be a no blame culture, because as soon as you start blaming, as soon as you start sort of reprimanding people for making mistakes, then they'll stop reporting, which means you can't learn as an organization. Malware and ransomware risks. Again, those 2 reports that we talked about at the beginning to set the scene, reinforce how important this risk is to manage. And it's generally controlled with a combination of training, which we'll talk about in a bit, but also these technical controls. And the technical controls essentially are, let's say, culturally difficult to accept because they cause inconvenience. The people don't like to run updates on their machines, and they don't like to separate the user admin because it brings in an element of inconvenience. And this is where it's important to involve, another reason why it's important to involve the business owners and the asset owners in the decisions, because the inconvenience has got to be balanced with the business risk. And it's the leadership team that will promote the good practices. A security controller or an IT department find it very difficult to implement those behavioural changes that are needed. So again, this is an area where you need dashboards and monitoring controls and governance reports to make the controls work. And finally, the user one, which is probably the most important one, because no matter how good your technical controls are, they can always be breached through human error or unsuspecting complacent staff being socially engineered. There's a good staff training video available on the NCSC website that, if you haven't already got anything, it's a good starting point because it covers defending yourself against phishing, creating strong passwords, securing your device, and reporting instances. There's even a little quiz at the end that reinforces the learning. So to try and bring all that together, this is the final slide, by the way. To try and bring it all together, we can optimize our security posture by making sure that we've identified what our business critical assets are. But not only the business, but who owns each one. Making that owner accountable for the security controls. Then what we would do is do a risk assessment, a gap assessment using whichever framework we choose to use. But essentially all those frameworks say the same thing. talk about the same security controls. And the way that we implement the controls is going to make the biggest difference. We've got to involve the asset and the risk owners. And so if you haven't involved them, or you haven't even identified them, it's absolutely essential that that's what you do, because that's what buys in the leadership and the people with the budgets, the people with the resources to make things work. And when you're balancing that inconvenience that security brings to the table, you've got to balance that with the business need to get work done. It's usually a business decision that needs to be made. But if the people making those decisions aren't aware of the risks and haven't been involved in the risk assessments, then obviously their decisions are going to be not the best decisions to be made. So in order for that leadership role to work properly, they need to be involved in the risk decisions, but then they need scorecards, dashboards to monitor and track progress against those desirable outcomes that we've identified. We need to continually learn from incidents. And it's not so much about how many incidents or what incidents or how they happened. We want to learn from them so that we can trend them, identify the underlying problems, and get some preventive actions that are effective. The training program needs to be for all levels, and that might mean that you've got different types of training for different levels within the business. But it's important that everybody gets trained. And you might want to then consider there's a core element of training that everybody gets, but then there's some specialist training that different people get based on the risks that they're exposed to.